Welcome, everybody, to this final virtual session of the Future Ready conference series that leads up to the physical conference we have on October 23rd. So if you wanted to attend a physical conference, it's on the 23rd of October at Tangs Marriott, and you can check out our website. The theme is called Peers, Places, and Platforms. The concept being that for the peers, I mean that's is the overall theme is called the Future Empowered Communities, and so for the peer segment, we were considering whether the small group can be a meaningful unit of transformation, and there we'll talk about different circles, giving circles, learning circles, and for places, the question there was how do we tap into unique strengths of a specific locality so that people are activated to support one another, and for platforms it seems to us that empowered communities are maybe local, but they are often open and connected. So how can platforms do that work? And the structure of our events has always been kind of virtual sessions, such as today with Benjamin Stokes, to share an interesting idea. And then the conference is always local. I guess it makes sense from a climate point of view. And also, there's a kind of a bias to action. All the people we want to talk to, we're considering interesting ideas that we might try to do here. So maybe, possibly we could design a real world game in Singapore, tapping into Topod, Future Ready Fund. The Future Ready Society Conference Series is a partnership between the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, IPS, and Topod. And I would like to introduce our speaker today. We are stoked to have Benjamin Stokes name, but bear with me. This is Benjamin has almost, it's from my point of view, the perfect job. He's an associate professor in American University in communications, but he also runs a Playful City Lab, and he gets to teach and do research, but also get to design games. And somehow, we got to figure out how he managed to get that stint, which sounds perfect to me. And we want to, I guess, the reason why we're interested in real world games, and you can tell us more about this specific genre of games played in real life, and also more about games for change in general. So, when people talk about games, they think video games, and that's largely entertainment, but there's a whole movement towards games for social impact and games for change. And there's various terminology, like serious games tends to be about education, and so we maybe to kind of tap his brains a little bit to understand this landscape. But my specific original interest in games was from thinking about game design principles and applying it to, for example, public or social services. So, I was thinking how the usual social service experience can be gamified to some extent. So I was thinking about how nested victories and relevant rewards, how to get clients to get engaged, because it sounds like the game designers understand our psychology so well. We get addicted to some kind of experience. So if we can use some of that kind of intelligence and apply it to a real world experience, what would it look like? So we actually did a simple experiment whereby we worked if an agency was doing financial assistance, and we applied some of these game design principles to kind of reimagine financial assistance towards something like a family challenge where people participated as a family and unlocked certain kind of credits they can use to support their own family lives. I think real world games specifically here seems to have a lot of potential for community building, getting to know neighbors, placemaking, and building a vibrant city. So without further ado, we'll spend about an hour, and Benjamin will tell us more about his work. And then the next hour, we'll have a dialogue and a Q&A session. Over to you, Ben.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's really very exciting to be with you for exactly some of the reasons you mentioned. I think the alignment of what you're looking into for the Future Ready Society and my work on real world game design has so many intersections. I think we're really just starting to scratch the surface. As the real world and the physical side of it intersects with the digital increasingly, I think that game design is an incredibly powerful set of tools that we've been a little bit blind to because they're right in front of us. There are aspects of game design that are as old as culture. In fact, we do not know of a culture anywhere in the history of the world that did not have games and game design in it. Of course, in the digital world, we've thought initially that those are toys for young people. But what's really becoming clear in the real world, in the physical world, as our cities adopt digital data flows and tie into sensors, that there are so many opportunities, not just to tie into the digital, but actually to connect people. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is how real world game design is sometimes educational, but even more, it's about the social structure of society and how people come together in public space, in cities. And I think that they will continue to do so in a digital future. I wanted to give a quick overview. I'm going to be talking today about two things. First, some surprising uses of play. My hope is to surprise all of you with some kinds of play you haven't seen before. And as a hint of what you're going to see, I'm going to be looking for play that ties to cities and that ties to social cohesion. Often not gamification, which I think is an interesting term. I do borrow some parts, but there are parts of gamification that I think we should be cautious of, mainly because they don't always work very well. And we can talk about that more in some of the discussion. Second, I do want to offer some practical principles of play. So these are principles that you can use in many places. In fact, I want to be clear, I'm not here to argue that everyone should be building games, but rather that more city services should be borrowing the principles of game design, that we should be considering playful engagement, and that if we understand what games do well, we can pull them into our services, our public engagement, and our attempts to make cities more just and equitable places. So this talk borrows from my book that came out in 2020 from MIT Press, and I have a hard copy too. It's always fun to see the physical. If you want to grab the physical or check into libraries. This was really the first book that has come out trying to show a number of different examples about how games can make neighborhoods and communities stronger. Stronger places is really what I'm interested in. And I think that there's incredible potential, and maybe most importantly, that it's just growing. We're going to see the tools of game design become democratized in some of the same way that happened with the tools of film. With a cell phone now, you can take video, but still most people don't know how to design a digital game. And I think that this is partly a matter of literacy. Even people that play a lot of games may not have experience in designing them. But it's also a matter of making the tools accessible so you don't necessarily need to code. And some of the future of how AI is changing the design process means that I think more and more communities will be able to make their own games without needing to develop advanced engineering and technical skill. So we're going to be seeing a revolution in the accessibility of game design for each and every city to make their own kind of versions of games. I wanted to, as context, say that I work at something called the Playful City Lab, which is part of the Game Center at American University. I run the Playful City Lab, and we're really interested in stronger places. We have two strands about how we understand that. First, playful tactics, which I've talked about a little bit with games, but second, that community storytelling is really a part of that as well. And here I draw on a tradition that recognizes that if we change the stories of our communities, we often can directly address equity and how people engage with our cities and communities, from issues of crime to civic engagement, to changing what kinds of behaviors people do for healthy lives and working across social groups, across lines of race, class, and gender. So 20 years ago, I founded something called Games for Change with several other people. I was one of the co-founders, and Games for Change now is the global movement hub for games and social issues. The annual conference takes place in New York. This year, one whole day was in the United Nations building in New York City, and it brought together people from countries all around the world who are doing really interesting experiments with games. A number of UN agencies were talking about their work, and we really talked about how games connect to the Sustainable Development Goals in so many different ways. Yes, games can be educational. They can be part of an educational curriculum, but they are also part of shifting gendered relations, for example. There are people who spend a fair part of their time in games, and the gender dynamics there can be really something we need to work on as a society. So the UN is recognizing that games intersect with so many aspects of our lives, to universal access to primary education, health, the environment. The environment was a topic that came up a bunch, and I'm going to be talking about some of these different kinds of games today, but I just want to recognize that over the past 20 years, we've really seen a huge change in how the government sector, the private sector, and nonprofits are starting to recognize games as serious tools. I've also spent some time as a funder. I worked at the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, which is one of the prominent United States foundations that funds in the United States things like housing and a lot of social services. So for me, this bringing together of games and how we fund things like social services is really a central question for me. And I'm excited that aligns with what you're doing with your series. I also just wanted a quick shout out to my team. I have a number of different graduate students, game designers, artists who are rotating through my lab, and their work comes into many of the examples I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so let's dive in. Games and cities. When I say that, a lot of people picture something like this. So this is a game that was made with an engine called Eris. It's a great project that was about going to specific places using your mobile phone, and the location of where you were in physical space was mapped onto the game and the game experience. But when I ask my students in game design, is this what we're talking about? If this is all they can name, I give them half credit, because there is such a wide range of what games can do. And I want to show you a few of those examples. Even bringing game culture into our physical cities in ways that feel more part of the built environment, such as here is a skyscraper in Philadelphia with the Guinness World Record for the largest architectural video game display. And this was a record that was set in 2013, first with Pong and then Tetris in the same place. And the display with 29 stories, I mean, you actually get 119,000 square feet of display, which is a pretty fun twist. One person gets to control the game. And in some ways, this is a good stretch to remind ourselves that our city environment is becoming a space where we can show and project digital media. But the temptation to just pull in digital culture, to pull in gamer culture, I would argue is not the full opportunity. There are so many more ways in which I think our real communities, our lived experiences, our social services should connect. So let me give you another example. Here is a fountain in Chicago. And this, you can see at the base of this fountain, there's a black granite reflecting pool. There's a water coming out of the mouth of, this is a giant screen, and photographs of people from that look just like someone you might see in the neighborhood. Different faces appear. Sometimes they'll blink. They might look at you. And then their mouth might open and water might shoot out. And there's this little bit of surprise that happens here. And I wanted to help all of us come to a definition of games, because as I've argued at the beginning, games are as old as culture, but many of us couldn't name game properties in the way that we could with, for example, books or movies. If I say plot, everyone says, oh, right, I know what the plot is about. But if I say game mechanic, define the game mechanic, so few people can define what a game mechanic is. By the way, a game mechanic is just an action you repeatedly take to make progress in a game. Well, here, the principle of this design that is like a game, the design principle that I think is relevant is partly the playfulness that is encouraged in this space. And of course, public spaces, architecture, playgrounds, all already invoke playfulness, support playfulness. And one of the ways that games do this is by having a certain amount of uncertainty. In this case, what I love about this fountain is that the water doesn't always come out the same amount. When the face first opens up, the water might come out a little bit, then the lips might grow wider, and the more water might start coming out, and young people will rush over, try to get close, but not too close, and then suddenly the water will spurt out further, and some of them will get wet, and they'll run away laughing. Some of these dynamics of pacing uncertainty in a space where playfulness is the prevailing attitude is incredibly powerful. And it's so different from what we often do with our social services, where we say, this is important, you should do this. There's a lot of should and preaching and finger pointing that happens, which is in some ways both justified but counterproductive if the goal is engagement. So when we're learning from systems of engagement, I think it's often especially helpful to step away from something that looks like a video game, to step away from Tetris, to look at architecture, to look at public spaces when we're trying to think of how things work in cities. There is also a challenge here. The challenge might be, can you get close to the water without getting wet? And often young people will invent the challenge themselves. Here, the challenge doesn't have to be spelled out. No adult said, you have to go get close to that fountain. You must get close to the fountain. No, not at all. The system itself encouraged people to set their own challenges. And this ability to pace the challenge in a playful space is something that games do incredibly well. When we think about an installation like this, though, we might be a little concerned at the cost. So this is a fountain that costs $17 million US. It's a very expensive project, which isn't to say that plenty of cities aren't doing things like this. Singapore, New York City, I live in Washington, DC. Plenty of cities are making investments in public space, and that's great. They should keep doing that. But there are so many more small neighborhoods. There are so many more suburban communities and poorer neighborhoods that need access to some of the engagement of play, that I draw some of my inspiration for how we should understand play by actually looking at poorer cities or cities that have a much more diverse economic base. And I want to take us to Mexico City for a second. Here is a project called Mapaton that was done by an innovation lab tied to the Mexico City government. And this is a project around mapping the bus system. Now, at first glance, you might think that, of course, the city knew about the bus system, but it didn't, which is part of the interesting thing. The city allowed independent companies to start their own bus routes wherever they could start getting riders. And this allowed a system to emerge on its own at massive scale, 14 million rides a day. Informal routes and a bit chaotic. The city said, well, maybe if we could map where these buses are going, we could start to provide data services on top of that. Even something like, well, how might you on an app ride from here to there? The city couldn't answer that question. Google couldn't answer that question. The mapping software couldn't answer that question. So they said, could we make a game that would help us map this? And this is one example of what games can do is games can actually gather data. They are often playful experiences on top of some sort of technical structure. And this is how the city said about doing it. They said that if you play this game and help us map these different routes, we will give you points for the miles you've ridden. And at first, that it all seemed to be going pretty well. And in fact, over just a couple weeks, they successfully mapped 40% of the informal routes in just a couple weeks. But what the city realized along the way is they were mapping the rich neighborhoods much more completely than they were mapping the poor neighborhoods. In other words, the same problems that plague our physical spaces, where some neighborhoods are a little left out, and social inequity is often concentrated by geography, was appearing in the game system. The interesting thing is that policy can also appear in game design. So what the city did was they said, we're going to start shifting the incentives and you get more points if you go to neighborhoods that have less connectivity, that have fewer smartphones. So suddenly the smartphones from rich neighborhoods started riding routes they wouldn't otherwise have ridden. And on one hand, this made the data more complete, but I'm personally much more excited about this for how it also encouraged social mixing between the people in the richer neighborhoods and the poorer neighborhoods. Some of those connections, some of those looking across the boundary and asking, how does your neighborhood work? How does my neighborhood work? This then led into the data generated from this game led into a design session that did create an app for the city to try and map some of those informal bus routes. So I think it's a really interesting way in which government is starting to think about using games and game design, even in cities that are sometimes less well off. The kind of game that I'm talking about here has two properties I wanted to share. First, they are embedded. They're embedded in public space, sometimes embedded in libraries, or even game design tied to urban furniture, tied to benches, tied to bus stops. And second, that they are trying to strengthen the place, to leave the place stronger than they found it. The game is not an escape. This is not games where we try to get away from our lives, but actually, by virtue of playing, we might connect more completely with the place that we're in, connect more deeply with the community, get to know the place in an even more authentic way. I think that's the challenge. These are not games that are about an alternate reality. These are about connecting with the existing reality more completely. And by that, I often mean that they connect us to the local identity of the place. They connect us to local businesses, and they connect us to local history. Those are just three ways that I've seen games work really well to connect us to place when we choose to. Now, the question is, of course, when do we choose to? And national entertainment companies often do not have an incentive to do any of these. It's much cheaper to have a game that works everywhere. A game like Pokemon Go that might be relatively the same in many different cities, as opposed to making a game that does connect you to the local identity, to local businesses and local history. This idea of play, though, as something that we can engage with and interact with, deserves a little more attention. So in giving you a definition of play, which I'm almost there to hand off, I want to give you another example from Mexico City that's with a fountain. And this is a fountain that has 17 jets of water in it that shoot off at different times. And the fun part, if you zoom out a little bit, this is what it looks like when they installed these pressure pads around the edges of the fountain and turned it into a system that residents could engage and even program. So you can see these pressure pads have up, down, turn, repeat, play, and effectively, by using these different buttons, by jumping on the giant pressure pads, they could program the fountain, the 17 different jets, to appear in different orders, to come together and do a kind of dance, to spell out a message. Really a way to have the feedback be different than just to an individual. And I would argue this is really important as we think about games and the future of cities as being more than just devices in our hand. It's tempting to think that mobile phones are the most powerful thing we've got. But I think actually cities have something that the digital technology companies often overlook. They have public spaces as their feedback loop. What we have here is a visual display of higher resolution than any computer is going to get to in the near future. Reality is ultra high resolution. And it has really interesting feedback loops that are way more interesting than what Pokemon Go can do. And the question of how we design our cities to start drawing on some of the early technology, and this is very early for game design, very early for being able to bring play and into digital feedback loops with physical space. But it's a choice that we have. All right, I've given you now enough examples that I can offer you a definition of game-based activities that you can use. Here it is. Game-based activities structure participation through first playful challenges. They're playful, but often they give a little bit of difficulty. It's not too hard and not too easy, just right in between. Second, they have feedback loops. So when you do something, like you step on the pressure pad and the fountain goes up, you see it immediately. And third, they have these uncertain outcomes. If you do the same activity, it might be a little different the next time. Each of these are things that often we don't do when we're designing social services for our cities. Let me just very quickly go back through them again and just illustrate how different these are. First, I mentioned we are often not playful in tone. We are dutiful. We are very serious. And I think that the challenge here is, can we be playful, but at the same time engage with serious content and with social connection? And I would argue the answer is yes. If it's a balancing act, but I think there's a lot of opportunities to be playful. Second, the feedback loop in a lot of our civic engagement and civic services is actually often quite terrible. For example, people volunteer to help out, and 3 months later, we still haven't told them the impact of their volunteering. In a game, if you take an action, like you volunteer, you give blood, you help tutor someone, the more immediately you can show them the consequences of their contribution, the more satisfying it is. And last, this idea of uncertain outcomes. Often we have it's tempting to try and control things so we can really predict exactly how it will go. Each person that comes in and has a volunteer experience will have a good experience. Well, in some ways that's good service design, but it's not engaging. And if the goal is really to shift from predictability to engagement, sometimes we might have to sacrifice a little of total control over the system in order to have people really interested in what's going to happen next. And I think that not all three of these have to be present in every one of our designs. I would encourage all those listening to consider one of these. Try one of these three with a service that you're designing, and possibly two. And if you get to three, you have a game. And I think that's a great thing. But again, that's not always the goal. It doesn't have to strictly be a game. A game-based activity is often sufficient to get some of the huge benefits of play and games. I wanted to turn to commercial games briefly, and to talk a little bit about Pokemon Go, simply because it has changed our imagination of what play and cities can be. And I was actually funded by Niantic, the company behind Pokemon Go, and the Knight Foundation, which does work around journalism in the United States, to study how several cities were trying to redirect some of the momentum and energy around Pokemon Go to social and civic services in their community. In one case, I flew out to San Jose, California, for a project that was trying to get people in the community out in their own streets to try bicycling if they hadn't biked before, to try to connect and learn about another neighborhood, and to try and spend money in the local economy, in local restaurants as they played. So here are some pictures from the event. This is an annual event they were already running before Pokemon Go came out. In fact, before Pokemon Go came out, they already had 100,000 people turning out for this event. So in other words, it's already a large event. And I think this is a great place to start with game design. Game design is not a magic bullet that suddenly makes people care about things they didn't care about. That's a poor place to start design. I would much rather see people consider projects where game design is part of an existing service or activity that already has some momentum. Now here, when the city added Pokemon Go, they were able to add more than 10,000 additional participants. And that's a boost, a significant boost. They did it at very low cost. And in fact, it had a pretty significant return. The players who came out and played Pokemon Go alongside an activity that closed city streets for bicyclists and walking, so people were exercising, they were seeing their city in a new light. They were asking, what would it be like if we had a bike lane here? What would it be like if we closed the street and turned it into a park for a day? In fact, is this suddenly the largest park in our entire city that we've created for just a one-day experience? And how is game design a part of this? Well, the players came out, and just that boost of those 10,000 led to $500,000 in additional economic spending in that city over that day. So you can measure impact in pure dollars, if that's the kind of measure that you want. There are a lot of different ways of measuring participation, of course, but that's an easy and compelling one if part of what you're looking for is economic development. At the same time, the players' imagination of the city was really interesting because they brought a lot of their own energy. The map I'm showing here is a map that the city provided. Well, the players created their own map. Here's the map at bottom, where the players started identifying their own geography of Pokemon Go in the same space. What they would identify, oh, here's a nest that you need to look for the Jigglypuff, or maybe you head over here for a tentacle. This additional sense of what could be discovered as you're going on this city event led players to form clusters off the main route. They were exploring, they were interested in, their eyes were open and curious about the neighborhood that they were in. And in many ways, this was outperforming what the city was already doing with trying to get people biking to new neighborhoods and walking to new neighborhoods, because the players had such momentum to explore and to look. An interesting fact also emerged in how the city changed some of the demographics. The city is a city with a huge Latino population, Spanish speaking, a large white population. They didn't have very many Asian residents coming out to their existing biking events. When they added Pokemon Go, it shifted some of the race and ethnic mix, much more closely matching what the actual resident profile was. So I think this is also an interesting idea that by encouraging different types of games and play activities, whether that's Pokemon Go or soccer, whether it's rugby, that we can start to change a little of the demographics and try to make events that appeal to who actually lives in our cities and our communities. And I think that this is a really interesting example because it hints at some of how cities can try to direct some of the momentum from games as they emerge. I also wanted just to emphasize that what San Jose did is not the only option. San Jose was interested in drawing people into the city, and because they were able to add content to the game and have special creatures in the game appearing, they had people flying in from not only other states, but even other countries for this event. In another city, though, that I studied, Philadelphia, the city really didn't want people coming in from a lot of places because there were neighborhoods that really wanted to be protected, that were already being gentrified, and people who had lived there for generations were being pushed out. And in that city, they were much more interested in having the incentives be lower and encourage mixing just across neighborhoods within the city. And some of our research was able to identify that by changing some of how the city invested in incentives in the game, they were able to significantly change who came in, whether people came in from other states or just came in from within the city. So a game like Pokemon Go actually has policy implications, and smart cities of the future will be thinking about games and play as part of their ordinary strategies for how we engage residents in our city. I see 4 roads to how games can lead to community strength. And the first is building these kind of social ties, these networks of people within our places. By bringing them out to events and by connecting them to each other, we can actually build the social fabric, social capital, as it's sometimes measured, in our cities and communities. And I want to show a little of how we can do that in terms of another example with Pokemon Go in the city of Boston. When we brought together a project in Boston, brought together young people to help rewrite some of the Pokestops that were there and add more content to the game. Interestingly, at first they thought all they need to do was to invite those young people to come and play Pokemon Go. But it turns out that a lot of the young people didn't want to. They weren't interested. And this is an important lesson with play, is that not everyone likes all kinds of games. In the same way that not everyone plays soccer, not everyone plays basketball. There are very few games that have universal appeal, especially across generations and across gender. And so identifying how we can give people a role to participate is part of the challenge. In this project, what they discovered with these young people is the opportunity to write content for the game was actually more universally appealing than just telling them to come and play. In other words, even Pokemon Go, which we think of as an incredibly popular game, actually was not as popular as inviting the young people to write content for the game where they could describe their own neighborhood, the things in their community that were important to them. That was more universally appealing. At left, you can see, here's a mural that the young people involved in this project are in front of the same mural. Here's how the mural was initially represented in the game, and here's how it was after they participated in their writing exercise, you can see on the left, it simply says, this is a BYCC mural 1995. What they added on the right was, this is a locally famous mural created in 1995, which was remodeled in 2015 to include more women. In other words, they started telling the story of how they had come together and remodeled the mural to try and bring women into the story, to address social justice and gender equity as something that they are really proud of. And for those of us that are interested in civic engagement and people really working to make their communities better, this sense that we can make a difference, we know that that's critical to boosting levels of participation. And the content of games may be just as powerful for doing this work as playing the game itself. This is, I think, is a really interesting story for that building the connection to the group and to place. This is the second kind of community strength, which is how we connect to the group, how we connect to our shared identity, our beliefs about who we are, and what is our sense of place, is a way that games can actually make our communities stronger, including creating the content for those games. I want to show one other kind of community strength that can come through games, and I'm going to tie this once again to Pokemon Go, just because it's so universal and so many cities have considered doing something with it. This is another project in Philadelphia that started with libraries and offered walks, or Poke crawls, as they called them, to go on walks around the library and go to different features in Pokemon that are in the physical space, but also look at things that are in the physical space. The mural that you're seeing here at the right is a famous mural that's in Philadelphia. And in fact, Philadelphia is sometimes called the city of murals. It's very proud of its murals, wants everyone to know about its murals, but not everyone has walked around and gotten to look at them. What I love about this is that a bunch of different libraries were all able to do this project on their own. So it's democratizing the process. It's not that just the central library did it. It's not that there's one tour for the whole city. It's that many neighborhoods could all create little tours of what are their cultural assets, what are their strengths, what should they be proud of. And to do this, nonprofit organizations or libraries, in other words, organizations, not just individuals, not just players, but organizations, did some of the work to make the game have impact. And in turn, the game helped make those organizations stronger. They helped people learn about this mural organization that defends the city's murals, that repaints the murals, that raises money for the murals. So games can help strengthen the organizations that make civil society and our neighborhoods strong. So this is another road to community strength that we've seen with games, is they can amplify organizations. They can strengthen our group life and our representation. The kinds of games that I'm often interested in, as you're starting to hear a trend as I describe them, it's less about high-end games. Even if we mention Pokemon Go, I'm often interested in low-tech and accessible uses of them, ways that work across the digital divide. In fact, the project I was just describing earlier with the murals involved a print paper map that if you didn't have the game, or your data plan wasn't working, or you were with someone, an older person from your family who wasn't a player, you could still use the paper version. This is something that I strongly recommend considering with game design, is to avoid the temptation to make a purely digital game, because often the most universal mobile media is paper. Paper outperforms cell phones in many circumstances. And that doesn't mean you need a lot of paper. A single visual, even using the paper map as a way to kind of help translate or have conversations between players and non-players, is what public space is about. Public space is about that mixing of different kinds of people all coming together, all living in one place together. And in fact, sometimes you might want to consider trying a kind of game that isn't hardly digital at all. Here's a game called Reactivism that has been played in a number of different cities in Canada and the United States, which is mostly where I do my research. In this game, players are challenged to reenact a little bit of history or raise awareness about history at the places that it happened. So here you're seeing a player drawing in chalk on the ground a large shirt, and that's because this is the location of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, a famous incident of where a number of garment workers in New York City were trapped in a building and actually died It's an incident in US history that many people have heard about, but they don't know the location. And so by playing this game, when players earn more points by doing things like drawing in chalk or telling a passerby about what has happened there, they're bringing history into public space. And they're doing it in a way where ordinary people are having conversations about what this means. Of course, providing those players with enough information with cards so they could say, well, I'm just playing the game, but here's what I see, here's what I found, and I trust the people that made the game. The game was a way to start conversation among residents about what happened here, what happened in specific locations. The game led people to explore their city. So for players, it was about going to different locations, finding things out, often meeting new people as they played. But there was an interesting feedback loop. Remember that word I used before, that games have these feedback loops in them. One of the feedback loops involved taking pictures for social media at the different stops around the city, which means that non-players were also part of the experience. Part of the feedback loop was to make visible what was happening in the game to others. And I think this is another opportunity where games can really have much greater impact. Real world games can have impact both by being in the real world, but also by recognizing that real world communities have visibility beyond our screens. And when we just look down, it's just me and my screen, and I'm not making it visible to other people, both physically visible, but also visible even on places like social media, we might be missing some of those true feedback loops of how communities work. And in this way, there's a bridging between the flows of news and information that are in digital spaces and the flows of news and information that are in physical spaces. This is the fourth of my roads to community strength. The bridging flows of news and information, the digital and the physical, are both ways that we exchange. When I see somebody in person, when I see a neighbor and I say, hey, the trash wasn't picked up on Tuesday, was it? Or I see someone in front of my workplace and I say, hey, they're about to do an interesting project down the street that's going to bring in a new restaurant. Those are ways that information flows, and it should continue to flow face to face. At the same time, it's often disconnected from the digital, and game design that connects the physical and the digital flows of information can make communities stronger. Strong communities have those kind of connected information networks within them. So those are a few examples that lead to these principles about community strength. And I think that the future in some ways is going to bring more digital opportunities. But even as it brings more digital, I want us to keep thinking about the analog, keep thinking about the physical. This is a project that actually happened back 20 years ago in the Twin Cities in the United States. Something called the Big Urban Game involved these giant inflatable pieces, and teams had to move them from one location to another. It was a kind of race that was happening between the yellow and other colors. And one of the things I loved about this game was that it created a really good feedback loop, because the way they decided about where to go was to use a website that said, here's the current location. And everyone logged in online to see where was that big thing that they saw in their community yesterday. Where had it gone? You're checking the community site to see where it went, but also to vote. I think it should turn right at the park, and then it should turn left and go over the river. So this bringing people together around feedback loops that are both physical and digital, this connecting of the physical and the digital is a challenge that I think we can sometimes best tackle by doing interesting theater in public space. And this kind of theater is not necessarily expensive compared to the cost of developing an app or hosting a music festival. This can be relatively inexpensive if we think about the feedback loops as the goal, if we think about engagement as the goal. There are other kinds of infrastructure, though, that I think are coming and should be considered by all cities. Here's one that I think is pretty fun. Pop-up screens are coming to more places. This is a truck that we've used at American University. We call it the humanities truck because it drives around to different neighborhoods in our city with humanities content. If you go inside the truck, there's an exhibit space where you can see art on the walls. Often the art is featuring community members through interviews with them, community history. the large screen on the outside, you can see here, actually, that's the smaller screen. We also have a large pull-down screen, and the two speakers that you see here are actually tied to a pretty big sound system inside that's on batteries, and you can have outdoor movie screenings that could happen in any number of places. I raise this as a provocation because I think in the future, cities will be investing in solutions like this, solutions that allow a kind of pop-up digital infrastructure to appear in a community just for a period of time. And I think that when you contrast this to the fountain that I talked about at the very beginning, which might be millions of dollars, this is a solution that everyone can share. A community can have a game that activates and works for a period of hours or days. It stays in a neighborhood for a weekend, or there's a neighborhood festival. It draws a bunch of attention to the digital and perhaps launches a game experience. So trucks like this that are hybrids, they are physical things, but they're also tied into digital infrastructure, into multimedia. You could also set up laptops inside and do training, or have people charge up their cell phones, all sorts of ways in which the digital and physical can come together. The digital and physical are also coming together in urban infrastructure at the neighborhood level with what is sometimes described as furniture. This kind of furniture, like at the left, you can see a bench that was wired with buttons. This is in the Limerick Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, which is a historic African-American community. And the theme here is to have all of the installations tie back to culture from the African diaspora. So that's part of the coloring system. It's part of the kind of DIY ethos of repurposing and appropriating urban objects and turning them into playful systems. This one at the left was called the Beats Bench. So it's a musical system, and you can generate music with it. And of course, that's playful. It's not necessarily a full game, but it's the start of a playful experience. In the center, you can see a news box that was repurposed from holding newspapers to now when you open it, it triggers a Raspberry Pi to do interesting things. There's a screen in there. You can interact and ask questions about news. The point is to use these physical objects. On the right, you can see it's an old payphone that's been repurposed. You can pick up the payphone and hear audio with it or look at the screen. So all of these are installations that use Raspberry Pis or small microcomputers, and there are lots of engineering students working on projects like this, but there's a key difference. All of these are outward facing. Instead of saying, make this at home, take this home, you can own this too, which is a lot of our rhetoric around 3D printers and makerspaces, has this very consumer focus, take this home. Instead, here this says, bring it out, bring it to public space. How can we take our engineering and our designs and offer it up to neighborhoods and the public? And I think this is also part of the future of games and play. We have more neighborhoods and communities that are teaching our young people how to make things with these microcomputers. All we need to do is that one extra step to encourage them to bring them out into public space. Finally, as we think about game-based activities, as I offer this definition to you, I wanted to talk about some recent research we've been doing to democratize the tools. And by that, I mean to make it so that anyone can start to make games and do the digital design as well. We have a project that we've been building a game engine, an authoring tool we call Hive Mechanic. And we have three kinds of games we've been talking about in particular. The first involves texting with a sculpture or mural. So take a piece of public art, a big prominent object, and you can start interacting with it. And texting, whether it's old school classic texting by SMS, or whether it's a newer service for in exchange, is in some ways so basic that we look past it. We start to think, oh, is that really actually engagement? But it is, of course. So many people use that on their phones, and there is no sign that chat is going away. This kind of texting and chat is going to be part of our digital space, and it's incredibly accessible. So this is maybe I'll just talk about this project first, and then I'll jump to the others. This sculpture project that we built is a 5-year art installation with a 50-foot sculpture in Virginia, Reston, Virginia. And the artist that built this piece was talking with me about how much she wanted to have residents learn about what the making of this sculpture, and especially some of the history behind it, the hidden goal of engaging people with art and with learning who the artists are. And so you can see we put down at the bottom here this little sign, this sculpture texts back or talks back. And that little sign has a QR code that encourages people to start just interacting with it digitally. The key, though, is that the interaction keeps in this conversational space, because the sculpture doesn't just send information. The sculpture talks to you. It addresses you. We think about bringing and activating public art, murals, even imaginary objects that don't exist yet. What mural should we make? What monument should be here? Should we change this monument from one that's been here for 50 years to a different one that more represents who we are and the future of where we want to be? And our authoring tool and system is running this text with a sculpture, but also we've been working with libraries around the United States. In fact, here's a quick map we just put together of the projects that we've been working with over the past year that have made all sorts of different projects of their own. We're really interested in libraries as places that communities come together, neighborhood libraries, often not the big library in the center of town, but the small libraries at the edges. That invite people to say, well, what's our history? What do we want to engage people with? And can we be playful as we do it? I want to show you a few projects that some of the other libraries have made. This was a neat one. Outside the library, there was a sculpture that had little birds up in this metallic tree. You can see some of them here. This sign was put up in front of it, and the sign said, do you see us, birds? You can text with us. So again, it's inviting people to text with a sculpture or with public art. This was a neat one, partly because they got the library involved, but also their state representative was encouraging people to try it. All sorts of different people around the state of Wisconsin were engaging with this project, even though it seems small and it started as a small effort. Word about it started to spread. I want to show you some very different kinds of things you can make with these simple tools. This is a neighborhood concert that was happening in a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. called Adams Morgan. And here, the team members got on stage with a big sign that said, we're having a raffle. All you have to do is text our number and you can get signed up for the raffle. But there's an interesting twist. When you text the number, you also get sent a little bit of history about the neighborhood that you're in. By the way, we wanted to tell you a little about the neighborhood. And there are some interesting game mechanics that then started to come into play. For example, if two people texted, they didn't both get the same photo. Intentionally, they were each given a different photo. And this is a little of this sense of uncertainty that causes people to say, wait, you didn't get the same as me? Let me look at what you got. Most of when we design these kinds of services, whether that's museums or libraries or educational institutions, we assume we're going to figure out the best thing and we'll give it to them the best thing first. But what if the best is to cultivate some of that uncertainty so that neighbors actually talk to each other? So they say, I want to know what you got. Oh, what is that? To start this conversation. We call these conversational mechanics, where the goal is, yes, to convey the information, but even more, it's to start a conversation. And sometimes an extrinsic motivation, like a prize or a raffle, gets things started. But it's really the goal is to build on that experience, to have people start engaging with history content. Here's another project just to show one more that's more on the audio side, an existing exhibition at a library this is the Central Library in Washington, D.C. On community history, was told in a very serious tone that was about the history of Black feminism in Washington, D.C., but our system was brought in to make it playful. And what you see here is a postcard at the front. When you scan the postcard, your phone dials and you hear audio that's by one of the community residents who was featured, but only briefly. And what she does is she says, I want to give you some of the hidden history, what you're not seeing here, and from my perspective, what really matters. And this idea that rather than trying to summarize all voices and have the content be fair to everyone, at the same time, we can bring in certain voices that are much more engaging and that pull people in to learn about their community and their history. So these are just a few examples of the games and activities that have been made with Hive Mechanic, this new system that we're pioneering. It's an open source system. We're glad to have others use the system, use the software, because part of what we're interested in is, does the future of our cities depend on tools that everyone can use, tools that are not owned by one company that has a big entertainment product? I love Pokemon Go. There's nothing wrong with Pokemon Go, but it's very hard to have local control of the content in Pokemon Go, or to do interesting mechanics that are conversational to try and get people talking to each other. We have very little control over Pokemon Go in many ways. And I think that some of the future of real world games requires giving our communities just as much control over the play in their streets as they have over creating playgrounds for their community, for their neighborhood, or for designing where do crosswalks go, where do bikes go, how close should a school be positioned next to businesses. I think that the future of playful and real world games is going to involve giving communities some of that control as well. So I hope that you've gotten to see a few surprising uses of play, as well as some of the practical principles of how we might define games and game design, and apply some of those principles to social services outside of strict games and into all of the spaces that we care about for our cities and our communities. So with that, I'll pause for questions, because I suspect that there are lots of opportunities to go into how this could be useful, and even to unpack some of the terms like gamification that might be of interest to your community. So with that, Dr. Lee, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I think for the next segment, I would request participants to switch on their video and to ask a question directly, because it's always nice to see people's faces and see your responses to the questions. Like, it's feedback, right? So we want Benjamin needs tight feedback loops. And also, but if you prefer to type question in the chat, I will kind of surface those questions to Ben. But if you ask a question, you get to cut the queue. Suyen has Suyen didn't have a question. She basically thoroughly enjoyed your session. Did you want to ask anything?
No, but I'm just like blown away by all the examples and how gaming can collect data, and the fact that young people, they don't want just to play the game, but they want to help design the game. It says something how we should be designing programs or activities for the community. I feel so schooled today. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
There was somebody from the National Arts Council who needed to pop out, but she still should come back. But she said that this is entirely relevant to her team's work. Maybe I can just kick off some of the questions. The thing that I was thinking about was a question to Ben is, to what extent do you think some of these games can have deeper transformative potential to creating community? Some of them can be fun. I guess it builds a vibrant interactional space, like talking to a sculpture. What do you feel also that it can deeply transform, like the community relationships that neighbors might have with one another in a significant way?
Yes, I think it's a great question. And this here, I'm inspired by some of the words of Jane Jacobs, the urbanist who talks about how we need multiple uses of public space. And I extend that to think about we need multiple kinds of games, some more transformative and some less. And I think that both are important goals. If I think of transformative games, I want to recognize that a lot of cities are investing in game infrastructure already when they do things like build soccer stadiums. That these are investments in play and games. And if you go through 10 years of playing football, you really get to know people, and you might get to know the adults in the community that are other parents and coaches. And so in some ways, I would argue that we are already seeing transformative engagements with play. But that kind of transformation is not instantaneous. Very few people play one game and their life is totally changed. Their life is changed when they're able to continue playing. That first game might be a hook, but they keep coming back. And there's been some great research around how social connection and transformation might be as linked to the structure of the leagues around the games as the games themselves. And specifically, I'm thinking about bowling and the work of sociologist Robert Putnam, who wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone. And his argument was that we have social capital is built around games and play in kind of transformative ways when neighbors are brought into contact with people they wouldn't otherwise meet. In other words, if you just go and play, you're playing with your family again and again, you get to know your family better. And there's nothing wrong with that. But where we really saw transformative social capital is when cities designed league structures. So people from this neighborhood, people from this community, older people and young people were forced to mix and connect with each other in order to, play in a bowling league and perhaps be the champions, to be the winners. So the league structure here may be what is transformative, if by transformative we mean about social connections, the mixing of social groups. If we mean it from an individual perspective, individual transformation can happen as well. And sometimes that's just like a book can be transformative, a game experience can be as well. I often, though, defer for that kind of experience to art games in the same way I might refer to art films or art books. Really strong, powerful narratives are often created by artists. And we should still look to great game designers to make some of those experiences. They may be bigger than any one city, a great game that really changes how we see things. And video games are definitely artistic media. In the United States, we've seen them be recognized by the national galleries in the same way that visual art, you can now get the top awards and be in the top galleries and places for video games as well. Kind of in between, I mentioned bowling, clearly a physical game, but when we think about esports, esports often has a content that we don't particularly care about. Most esports games I don't look at as something where they feel like about local history. That's not their content, but the league structure could be really interesting for getting people mixing. And I think that very few cities have started to think about that league structure. Instead, they've been focused on the profits and how much money we make and who's the winners. And I think that right now we have an interesting moment to think about that league structure and esports as part of that system. So these are just a few examples of how we might see that kind of transformation. I do want to offer just one last one, which is sometimes exploring is transformative. When you go on a walk and you happen upon a street that you haven't seen before, or even your usual route to work always takes you this way, and you go just one block over and you see, oh, well, here's an interesting little shoe repair store that I'd never seen before, and you discover a story with that. Sometimes that's a transformative experience to how we connect to our cities. And there is some history in terms of urban exploration and the uncertainty of going to new places where game design can take us a little out of our everyday in experiencing the built environment of the city. I think that's another opportunity for transformation. So those are a couple answers, but I think that it's a great question.
Since you mentioned bowling or basketball or soccer, those were the original real world games, I suppose. And if people form community leagues and they bonded over that, that's a way of playing a game that leads to some kind of solidarity. But it sounds still that sports are quite different from the games that you've given us examples of, which are played in cities, interactive, whatever. Would you say that the key difference is some kind of social mixing that you may not see in a bowling league, where a particular type of people play?
I think that there, for me, it's partly this shift from the kind of inward. It's just for either me or just for the participants to focusing outward, in the same way that we do with public space. That when we create a public park, we're doing it for everyone. We're facing out. I think that it's in some ways that's a very small change, but it has really profound consequences. And that's the first answer. The second answer I would add is I'm also interested in bringing the digital in. So traditionally, sports have no digital interaction as part of playing, but we're seeing that media is part of our public spaces. How we navigate is affected by the map application on our phone, how we socialize and connect, how we tell stories, how we discover news. And I think that especially as location-based content becomes increasingly part of our phones, and the Internet of Things increases the number of sensors that trigger different information that we might care about. Whether that's particulate count and pollution, and tying that into global warming and climate change. Am I in a place that has high carbon output or high particulate count? There are all sorts of interesting feedback loops that I think point to a different kind of game than sports. Sports don't have that outward focus. They have the kind of inward of just how I'm playing with just a couple other people. But the digital also encourages that outward, and flows of information and media, I think, are some of the future of where our cities are going and where play can go as well.
Hannah Al-Haddad had to step up, but she had a question that she posted, and it's basically about the inclusion of games, and she's specifically interested in neurodivergent students. But I suppose perhaps you could reflect on, in the design of these real-world games, were there considerations of thinking about who might be included or excluded from the game, and was there specific design strategies to try to be more open to more?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one of the reasons that in our authoring system we focused on text messaging as a really low tech, accessible tool that almost anyone with a phone can do some texting. Even in that system, though, we very quickly started to realize, well, we have speakers of English and Spanish, and many recent immigrant arrivals in Washington, D.C. are speaking Spanish. And so maybe that's a kind of accessibility, so language accessibility. Then we had another project come to us and say, well, actually, we have a community of people who are not super comfortable with reading and texting, but audio is how they prefer it. So that's a different kind of like support for different sensory orientation. Some of our games are entirely audio, and the game remembers where you are. You push 1 if you want to head in this direction, push 2 if you're interested in branching the story over here, push 3 if you liked the joke and want to hear more about the joke. So you can do all sorts of branching stories, choose your own adventure, escape rooms, all with audio. And that's possible with your phone, and it has a very different kind of inclusion than text messaging. But texting, for example, works very well if you're in a loud, busy space. So when we've been at concerts, being inclusive often means not depending on audio, not relying on headphones, but focused on texting. And I think that the flexibility to build for different spaces is and different audiences is similar to some of the challenges of thinking about neurodivergent participants and how they might engage or participate. The kinds of stories we write, and how we also frame our invitations is also part of that kind of inclusion. But it's a challenge, and in many ways, I think cities are actually ahead of game design on this front, because cities are forced to think about inclusion, to think of accessibility, to think about how do we make the curbs so that anyone could get on and off. There's been a lot more legislation supporting accessible cities than insisting on accessible games. So those movements, though, I think are coming together, and real world games are going to both reveal some of the need to bring the digital and physical into accessible connection, but also offer some opportunities for doing that in new ways.
It occurred to me that there's some kind of analogy between games for good and maybe social enterprises, in the sense that the social enterprises both have to be physically, financially sustainable, have a business model, but also achieve some social good. So some kind of double bottom line. And I wondered if you felt like games for change had that double pressure that it has to be engaging and entertaining, but still achieve social good, and therefore actually games for change are doubly difficult to make. Do you?
I do. I think that's I've thought many times about that exact comparison, that there is kind of a double bottom line. You both have to still make it a good game and be thinking about impact. And at first glance, it does seem like that means it's almost impossible, because we know that making great games is actually very hard. In the commercial gaming space, most people trying to make a game do not succeed.
Even when they're just trying to entertain you.
But here's the good news. The good news is that real world games actually have different kinds of distribution channels and different kinds of opportunities. So, and this is also true with schools. The kind of game that a student is excited to play, if the alternative is a textbook, you go and do this textbook or do this playful version of the same content. Well, we don't have to make it as entertaining as the latest Halo game. It doesn't have to be as polished as Pokemon Go. And I think that this is partly about recognizing that when the content really fits the situation, when the game fits to a different context where games are rare, there's a lot of opportunity to make things that are very much appreciated. People might really love a playful experience that is lightweight with a sculpture, because they've never texted with a sculpture, or certainly they haven't texted with this sculpture. This sculpture has its own personality, even if it's not the most compelling. And I think of this as kind of analogous. When we think about national media, we think about, well, would I be as interesting as a celebrity? And the answer is probably no. There's lots of celebrities who are better. There's lots of musicians who are the best in the world. But that doesn't mean if I walk into a bar and I hear a band playing, I might really appreciate that band. That band can be great for what it is. And I think that in this way, local and real world games have the benefit of the local experience is as valuable, the social connection around it. Who are the people that are there with me? All of those things mean that we're competing in a different way. And it does also force a different kind of design, because if you want to make it good, it can't just try to be high graphics. If you just do high graphics, it probably won't succeed. But if instead part of the joy of playing is that double bottom line, the joy is not just that you're playing the game and getting the social good, but actually the joy is partly the social impact, right? Mm-hmm. Part of the reason that you play is that you're getting to know your neighbors, and that's part of what you were hoping to do. You're learning about, you're connecting to your city, and that's one of the reasons you're there. So in that sense, it's both it could be doubly demanding, but it also has new opportunities for motivation that pure entertainment games don't have, and in fact, can't even touch.
Mm. Do you have any insight on under what circumstances the games don't actually work? Because I'm just thinking, sometimes I like an immersive experience where I have choice and control. Sometimes I just like to be a spectator and watch. And so I'm thinking, for a lot of maybe even social services that can be done in a very dutiful way, as you put it, versus a playful way. What's the thinking on whether is it that a playful approach will always be better, or there are circumstances where it actually backfires or maybe doesn't add as much value?
Yeah, well, I think that if you need to get an answer quickly, so efficiency, if that's your goal, I need to know how to file my taxes, I need parking information, then a playful experience where often the goal is not efficiency in the same time sense, because if you wanted to finish the game quickly, they could make all the games finish in 10 seconds, right? A fast game is very easy to design. No, actually, games often take longer because we want to sit there and play with it for longer, right? So I think that games are not a great solution if somebody already has a tool that gets them there faster. But if you think about something like a playground, the goal is not to be done playing as soon as possible, right? And when you take your children to the playground, the goal is not to finish in 3 minutes. No, today we're going to the playground, we're going to finish in 2 minutes. No, that's not. In fact, we'd love it if our children wanted to stay for 2 hours. So if the goal is sustained engagement, that's a space where I think play performs particularly well. And I think that there may be other spaces like that, where we can look for the power of play to be focused. One that I've highlighted in this talk is social connection, where the game opens up some of the space to talk to our neighbors. A lot of people actually want to know their neighbors a little better, but it also makes us nervous, and we need kind of an excuse. So the game gives you an excuse to do something that you kind of already want to do. And this is one of the reasons why I actually like to think about games with that double bottom line, that aligned motivation, as opposed to gamification, because gamification sometimes implies that if we add points, then suddenly we're going to change it and people are going to want to do it just because there are points. But like, I'm not going to want to go to the playground more because I get 10 points. Like, it's not about getting points. The points have to reflect something. The points should reflect a value system. And they're a way of kind of like seeing if I'm doing well on the thing I wanted to do. They should reflect something I care about. How many neighbors did I actually connect with? How well do I feel about whether I'm making a difference on climate change? I think that in that sense, we're not gamifying with extrinsic motivation. Rather, we're adding feedback loops that help people see their progress towards things that they want to connect to. And if that's things like getting to know our neighbors, connecting with our community, I think that's things that a lot of people really do want. And games are a pathway to that kind of engagement.
We have Sean Chua from Civil Service College who's raised his hand. Hi, Sean. You're still on mute, sorry.
Hello. Hi, Justin. Thanks so much, Benjamin, for the presentation. I just wanted to comment on this point about gamification as well, because I guess my question was going to be about how, especially in a time where there's almost a kind of over gamification of everything, there's like everything's saturated with gamification. And as you rightly pointed out, a lot of gamification has very little to do with play, right? It's just about this kind of artificial triggers to motivate behavior, which is very different from what you're discussing about, that kind of deep engagement that comes with this alignment of the double bottom line. I guess where my curiosity comes from is, in your experience, having worked with games intersecting with all these other spaces, real, like whether it's urban planning or any kind of adjacent kind of spaces, I'm curious in your presentation, you shared a lot about what we can learn from game design in these interventions, but I'm curious about the other way around, right? What can game design perhaps learn from placemaking efforts or all these other synergies that it's working with in the kind of examples that you've shared?
Yeah, I think it's a provocative question, and I think that the answer to me is that there's so much happening in the video game space, for example, that if you look in different niches, you can actually see people either learning from the real world or relearning the same lessons on their own, including on areas like community management. So a lot of what we've been talking about today is community engagement and that kind of connection. Online games that try to build a community have often recognized that you have to listen to the community. You have to give them some power. Stakeholders matter. And you can't just force people along, even though those were some of the initial instincts of not just game designers, but people designing all kinds of technologies. We'll find the pathway, we'll move them along the trajectory, we'll give them feedback to kind of move them along a linear path. And all of a sudden the community says, bring back that character. We like that character. We demand it. The kind of activism that happens around entertainment. It's not super political necessarily. It's just, we like that bit of the experience. Happens in cities too, where people say, we want to be near this theater. These are the things we want in our communities. So I think that one of the things that urban planning has been thinking about for a long time is how we support that kind of participation so that everyone feels like they could participate, but not everyone has to all the time, because we don't want to go to planning meetings all the time. Most people want to do other things with their lives, but we still want to involve them or allow some representative participation. And I think that the idea of stakeholders is something that urban planning really understands. If you're going to do a design, you want to talk to all the people that might be affected. And this is something that game design is still figuring out, and quite often is tone deaf, where they come in and they announce something to the players that they think is going to be good for them. They think the players are going to like, and they're frequently wrong. Although sometimes they're right. But in that sense, I think that there are things about power and different groups and how people can come together that I think that cities are pretty far ahead of where game design is, as just one example.
Sean, since you're here, I assume that you're from the game design unit at CSE, and maybe you could tell the audience a little bit more about the work you do, and so they can understand maybe some of the opportunities to both understand games better, maybe even to work with you guys.
Sure, thanks so much, Justin. Maybe just to give a little bit more context. So we are from the Learning Futures group at the Civil Service College. Within that, there is a team of us who look at, we're the CAST team that looks at it's called the Civil Service College Applied Simulations Training. We look at serious games and applied simulations within the context of public service. So where we're cited at, what that means is that a lot of our stakeholders are public officers rather than necessarily public-facing games and simulations, although we do consult with different agencies who might be working on those kinds of projects and interventions. I think within the CAST team, what we are really focused on right now is really about thinking about games and simulations as a kind of methodology to explore futures thinking, to facilitate a certain sense of collective intelligence. I think these are spaces that we're trying to explore deeper into. And I think one of the challenges that we sometimes face is trying to make that distinction between gamification and the kind of real opportunities for play, right? Because I think oftentimes there is a kind of mental model that games are perhaps the kind of silver bullet of engagement, right? As long as there's a game, that means people will do that more. But I think what we also see, especially with younger, well, actually on both ends of the spectrum, right? Because games can be very alienating for people who are not part of that gamer culture, right? Especially for sometimes older folks. So there's a degree of it that can be alienating. And then on the other end of the spectrum, with the younger folks, I think there's also a sense of growing maybe skepticism also of when everything is becoming so densely gamified. So I think having to kind of unlearn or rather help our stakeholders understand that games and gamification are perhaps very different things, right? Or rather that the kind of potential, the transformative potential of play versus the kind of mechanics of gamification to motivate behavioral nudges are almost very different, are actually very different kind of genres of intervention. So I think a lot of what you shared today was very helpful in giving a kind of framework or scaffold to maybe talk about, what does it really mean to think about the different kind of intelligences of games, as well as the kind of spaces that we're hoping these games could intervene in, as well as thinking about what does it mean to truly find that alignment of the game design, as well as what are the kind of outcomes or conversations we are hoping to drive with these game interventions.
Well, since you mentioned, I'm not going to let either of you go yet. You mentioned nudges, and I was thinking compared to gamification, and maybe both of you, Benjamin and Sean, could talk about the dark side of gamification, because there's some dark sides to nudges as a kind of, people consider it some kind of insidious manipulation. And is there a dark side to gamification where it backfires and people kind of you actually encouraging behavior that actually don't want?
I'm sure Benjamin.
I mean,
yeah.
I absolutely, yes. I think that there's a lot of risk of trying to deceive people, not be upfront, and it's not. And I think here the analogy doesn't have to be on strict gamification, but even things like frequent flyer points or insurance incentives, where we know that like the statistically best choice is not what a bunch of companies are doing with their business model. They're trying to pull people into things that are not economically rational decisions, but feel like compelling in the moment or play into some fear. And I think that those kinds of services and opportunities can align with aspects of games. But I want to even say a dirtier word, which is the gambling industry. Is when you say games, to some people, that's what they assume you mean, not digital games, but you're pulling slots or looking for chance. And I think I think we have to acknowledge that this is a part of why games are interesting, work with our brains. They tap into some of that uncertainty. What about this time? What about this time? I have control. If I root for this team, they're going to win. Actually, my rooting for a team has no effect on whether they win, but it feels really good to be part of that. How do we plan? So there's a whole class of different things that I think can manipulate our brain and around participation. What I feel with real world games, the benefit is that a lot of these lose credibility very quickly in a local face-to-face kind of setting. If I go to my school and somebody says, "Would you tutor?" and they trick me, they manipulate me, they tell me very quickly, all the parents will hear about it, right? These things I think are actually they're tempting, but they backfire very quickly when there's a good feedback loop among participants. And I think that we're still seeing how some of the online services got away with some of this because people weren't talking about it or weren't as aware about it, didn't feel as part of their daily lives. But I think that in some ways, real world games have a better kind of bullshit detector. Is this real? Is somebody trying to trick me? And nobody wants to be tricked. And so I think that respecting people, respecting the player, I think is at the heart. You get around some of the ills of gamification if you are being transparent about what the goals are and what you're trying to convince people to do, and you're helping them along those paths.
Sean, anything to add?
Yeah, I think actually one of the helpful frame about thinking, so I'm not saying that behavioral nudges is always bad or that gamification is always bad. I think the frame that has been helpful is to think about how, if you think about a stone that is rolling down the slope of a mountain, but there is something in the way, right? What a behavioral nudge is to help remove those barriers for the kind of direction or action that the stone is already going on. So I think that's a helpful way to think about it, rather than thinking about behavioral nudge as a way to artificially induce people to do things. And I think that is what maybe what Benjamin is talking about in terms of that kind of deception, right, that happens with these kinds of artificial incentives when we try to gamify certain things, maybe unethically. So being transparent about what the goals are is helpful. I guess the other drawback sometimes that can happen is that if the gamification is not done with a clearer understanding about what the context is operating in, sometimes when that gamification intervention concludes, people might revert back to the original behaviors anyway, or even like double down in those, right? I think sometimes how we try to, in our exploration, what has been helpful is sometimes borrowing from certain kinds of live action role-playing traditions, right? And thinking about playing to lose. So once you talk about playing to lose, that kind of shifts, reorientates players a little bit, right? So it's not so much about, okay, I need to be so focused on what the win conditions are, but maybe that opens up to a wider possibility of things that might be presented through the game itself.
I think that's a great insight, and you can just hear as Sean describes this that people that are highly literate in what games can do and how they work have so many tools at their disposal that it's not just they'll avoid a clear roadblock, but they'll kind of nimbly dance around and see all sorts of opportunities in the same space. I think this kind of literacy should be part of what we're training all of our people running social service programs to be thinking about. A provocative notion I'll put out there is that we actually need more of this kind of thinking in policy circles when we're thinking about healthcare policy, when we're thinking about retirement and how people plan for retirement. We should be using a lot more tools than the usual. We're just going to push content at people and preach at them. And I think that game design opens up some of this space for a much richer sense of how do people engage, think about cause and effect and systems. I'll add just one other little example. Badges as something that's come out as part of the gamification. You get a badge for getting to a certain level. Some of the research that I like best around badges says that they are not very motivating compared to their value for showing you the possibility space for where you might want to head. Oh, I can get a badge in doing this. I want to head in that direction. So they reveal possible trajectories that open up the motivation people already had. In the same way, like the scouts, if that's an example that is resonant. Oh, I want to learn how to swim. I'm gonna try to pursue that badge and build that skill. So I think that the notion a lot of gamification tools are raw incentives is just plain a beginner's mistake in many cases. It's the collection of things and it's the deeper design principles that I think we're looking for, and figuring out what they do well is something that I think we actually are making a lot of progress on.
I read a book called Values at Play in Digital Games, and also from MIT Press. And it was fascinating to me because the values of a game are often hidden. And so one example I remember was if you have this large MMORPG, and then the experienced players will quickly snuff out the new ones because they are weaker. And so in game design, you always have to balance it out. So they created incentives for experienced players to collaborate or support newer players so they didn't get killed off so easily. And then all that led me to think that, and also I wonder what you think of that. Plus also, there are now game designers who not just have a language to talk about game design, but are applying that language to talk about reality. So there are a couple of people talking about how if they looked at democracy and politics, that game is so broken from a game design point of view. And it's just fascinating. I'm going to send a link to that. And I wondered what, Ben, you thought of thinking of the world as a game, and
Yes.
is it fair to say that the games are broken or reality is broken? Right.
Yes. That's the book title. G. McGonigal has written about this. I think it's a great critique that once we build that game literacy, we can turn to things and say, oh wait, here in the United States, are some of aspects of our democracy, running for election, is like a game, right? You win the election, and wait, it has all these different things about what I defined a game. It has uncertainty. I don't know if I'm going to win the outcome. There is a genuine challenge, and I can only put in so much time. There are constraints. The choices have to feel meaningful. And then you say, well, how come so many people hate it? Well, it's not balanced well. You can critique democracy. In fact, I was a panelist on a really interesting session where we critiqued the U.S. democracy design from a game design standpoint and said, if we were to make this a game that was well balanced for engagement, what might we do? And while some of the founders were thinking about balances of power, there often wasn't a sense that designing the system for participation was the main goal. We wanted people to be able to participate, but not necessarily to want to participate. And I think that it's a really a big idea is to say, in what ways should we be designing democracy so that works better? I will counter that, though, with some of the experiments that are happening in participatory budgeting, and think about some of that from a game design perspective. I think a lot of those systems work best when the goal is actually building connection among the players and education about how budgets work, and is not about significant distribution of funds. This is not my comment here is a little bit is not always appreciated by some of the people in participatory budgeting who talk about, well, isn't the goal to do all of our budget in a participatory way? I think actually those systems from an engagement standpoint work well when the amount of money is deliberately kept very small. It's not about big budget allocations, but it's about a lot of people participating. And maybe, $5,000 goes to a charity, or it's a small bump in this, and we got to be part of that system. From an engagement perspective, that's much better. And so I think that the idea of turning everything into a full game where the goal is participation is provocative, but maybe also we should say, well, we want the system to work well, and the game full participation version is intentionally low stakes, both for ethical reasons and for actually what works well for engagement and learning.
That's fascinating. You should bring up participatory budgeting, because that's one of the projects as part of all this Future Ready series, and that we were hoping to do. participatory budgeting at our town council level, and we've kind of gotten some headway. And it's interesting to hear you say that, it's not maybe even small sums of money that encourage interactions with residents and neighbors built. And that's a good enough outcome rather than focusing on the actual what infrastructure was built with the budget itself. I wanted to kind of go on to ask you how would, if people were interested in designing real world or neighborhood games, how would they go about doing it? You obviously have a lab, and you presumably have game designers flow in and out of them as freelancers or for project basis. But also, how do you imagine communities getting involved? Is participatory game design plausible? Because it seems quite difficult, right? For example, even in research, there's participatory research, and then so you equip people to kind of focus, identify the questions, design the research questions, even go about collecting the data and co-analyzing the data, and that's a longer process for research. And I wondered if you felt that participatory game design would be even more challenging or less challenging as something like that.
Yeah, it's a question I've been thinking a fair bit about as I think about democratizing design and increasing access. Also, because I teach in a game design program, we do have master's degrees in game design and MFA, terminal MFA degree in game design, games and interactive media. So on one hand, I'm part of teaching people at a very high level to go off and be very good at it. But I'm also trying to work with libraries that have only an extra hour or two here and there. How do we think about balancing? Are each of those feasible? I think that it's about this multiple uses again. That recognizing it's not an either or, but it's probably both have their appropriate place. And you really want that high-end game designer if you're trying to make especially a deep content game. It's a little bit like making a deep film. A documentary. Somebody who's a really good storyteller, who's been practicing that art of storytelling, can probably create a really good story. But that doesn't mean somebody with a camera can't record something quickly that captures some really interesting, provocative footage. So both of those are interesting modes. In terms of working with communities as part of doing design, we've been seeing some interesting experiments, even with our own tool. One model that I thought was interesting, one town had a kind of scavenger hunt, and the library and professional staff created several of the locations, and then said, as part of launching this game, we invite the community to come in and add the fourth location. Come to our community meeting if you would be interested in helping design the fourth location. And then when people show up to that meeting, they have a pretty constrained process. It's not that you can make anything and we'll turn it into an escape room. No, it's probably going to be similar to the other stops. So the mechanics are figured out, some of the tone, there's an existing model, but the people can participate at the level of content, which is, it matches the example of Pokemon Go and the young people in Boston who are adding content in the game. They didn't get to change the game mechanics for Pokemon Go. They're not changing any of the incentives in terms of how raids work or any of that. They're really just writing content. And so in some ways, there are lots of opportunities to share power in the writing of content and refine the mechanics with people who are more practiced in that, or even to inherit a template. We've been playing with this idea of recipes, that scavenger hunts are things that a lot of people are familiar with. So we don't need to reinvent how those work at a basic conceptual level. We know some of the technical challenges, like when people are doing it in cities, they don't want to walk 10 minutes between stops. Like you want to have some constraints, and some of those should be maybe imposed from the outside rather than say, well, why don't you get to figure out how far apart to place your stops? Well, we know actually enough have been built, and very few people like to play scavenger hunts where you have to go 15 minutes between locations. So we can constrain some of those at the template level. And then let people add content. I think this is one path forward for how we share power. But I think in the same way that we've like the studies of participation in cities have talked about like ladders of participation, and where is it kind of tokenism versus significant engagement and sharing power in the design process, means that this is as complicated as doing something like building a new building and sharing power. Of course, we probably don't want ordinary residents doing high-end engineering when a building could fall over, right? So we don't share power at that level. We defer to experts. And in some ways, I think we're going to keep deferring to game designers for certain parts of game balance, some of the underlying technologies, rendering systems, safety and security, privacy, which comes up with games, who can know about my phone number if I'm texting with a system, who can know my location. And I think that some of those things, I think, the responsible approach is to constrain some of that, maybe to have citizen oversight, but not necessarily co-design for the whole process. And I think that the answer in some ways is it's both pretty simple to get started with some of that sharing of power. It's just an attitude more than anything else. And on the other hand, it's as complicated as it is with other things in cities, like building buildings, where we have to think about security and privacy and liability. So I think it's just going to be part of how we have to move forward, and also how we can move forward.
What would your advice be to, I mean, some of the people in the room might be social workers or community artists, data practitioners that have an interest in real-world games. They may not be trained in game design. Would you recommend that they go take a boot camp, a serious course in game design, or are there do-it-yourself manuals and nice exemplars of games that they can maybe take enough inspiration from and get started doing something?
Yeah, I think just get started doing something quickly. That's what we tell our students, but also it's what I would tell someone just getting involved, that young people, for example, are all game designers. I have a 3-year-old daughter, and she makes up game design and games and play. She role plays with dolls. She gives herself challenges. She tries jumping off the couch. Oh, that didn't work. She's going to try again. There's uncertainty. So in some ways, there's been a lot of good research that humans learn through play, and they design games for themselves to structure that play. It's a natural part of childhood, which is one of the reasons we associate games with being children. But we've often have taken that out. We don't allow people to do that later in life. And part of the reason is that actually we don't want to share power and let people really redesign their environment. If you want to be, game design really opens up a creative space where people get to try out all sorts of things, as opposed to a lot of our schooling, for example, is about classes will start on time. You will do the work that needs to be turned in. It's really about following directions and following rules. It's not about playfulness. It doesn't encourage uncertainty. It's not a fun game, but it's not about being a fun game. School is about learning to move through systems and social order in a lot of ways. I think that sucked some of our spirit of natural spirit of game design. So in some ways, it's kind of about getting in touch with your inner child, and letting yourself do things that even feel a little bit silly. There's a way in which game design, especially if we take an existing template, something like a puzzle hunt in a city. Anybody can do that. Go try that now. Why not, craft a puzzle where the answer to this clue requires knowing a fact or two about a particular monument. And maybe it's one that some people know and some people don't, but you could find it out by reading the plaque. Now, that's not necessarily a super exciting game right away, but then you think about how can you make it exciting? And sometimes the ways to make it exciting are as much about genre and narrative. Make it a mystery, make it dark, bring in humor. So all these tactics that come from the world of storytelling are part of good games. And this is one of the reasons why I think games are so powerful, is that games are part of, they incorporate storytelling and they incorporate systems of rules and engineering at the same time. They really are an interdisciplinary furnace where they bring all sorts of different things together in a powerful way. And if you can tell stories, you can focus on games that are about story. If you're a good visual artist, make games that are about visuals. So whatever kind of creative skill you think is fun, if you are inclined to do something like improv and tell jokes, make things up, there's all sorts of games that come from the comedy and improv world, which are games and actually are done in public spaces that are icebreakers that start corporate events, but also start community meetings. There's a lot of community engagement that happens with ice-breaking play at the beginning, and that can be a kind of game design space as well. So in that, my kind of stepping back, my big answer is really that game design is something that we can do in so many spaces that the biggest barrier is that we don't give ourselves permission. Instead, we really try to come up with efficient, dutiful tools to get things done. Even when we could figure out a playful solution, and things like icebreakers are good reminders that often the playful solution does work really well. We know if we want to get people talking at a retreat or event, doing something a little bit playful that throws them off, where they talk about a color or something they saw that weekend, or something they wanted to be when they were a kid, that gets people talking. And it sometimes is the best path to outcome that we're interested in: social connection, exploring space, thinking about systems, cause and effect. There's a bunch of things that games do better, and we should focus on those things, but really wherever you want to start doing game design and play, I hope everybody gives it a try at whatever age.
If some foundation here said, oh, we like this Playful City Lab, let's build one here. I'm going to give you a few $1 million. And then how would you advise people who are interested to set this up? Besides having a Benjamin Stokes here, right? What should the lab look like? Who should the lab hire? How much does it cost to run it?
Yeah.
And do you just take commission projects, or you design a game hoping to look for somebody to take it on?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I actually think that it's not just a hypothetical question. I think that more and more cities are thinking about how they can invest in these kind of experiences. In Mexico City, I cited a few of their projects, and that's partly because the innovation incubator that they set up there had an explicit mandate to think about engagement and playful outside the boxes approaches. So in some ways, if you're going to invest in an innovation strategy already, just think about your innovation strategy not just being about databases and code. It can't just be about like hackathons and engineering, because that doesn't lead to engagement necessarily. It leads to more engineering. And if our goal is simply to build buildings and bridges, great, we need engineers. But if our goal is engagement, if our goal is to think about how can play be transformative as it already is, then I think that having that be part of the mandate, having engagement be part of the mandate, and kind of playful at the values level for our innovation incubators, I think that's a great place to start. In terms of cost, if part of what we're trying to do is to build atop things like city open data systems, then obviously you need the coding and engineering expertise to build the models and the underlying systems. But that's similar to if you wanted to build a stadium, you need to have people who can build the actual seats and build. There are infrastructure questions that go with certain kinds of play. On the other hand, if your goal is to do the kind of play, let's say a city wanted to invest in an incubator, it could feel a lot like a strategic planning consultancy. We're going to help a lot of our social services do strategic planning, think about visioning the future in ways that are playful, but also that bring game design principles into their next program. That's something that would be almost entirely at the human level, at the level of strategy. And it would actually be genuine game design, but rather than the product be new games, it would be to bring game design principles into existing services and strategic planning. And I think that's an equally valuable contribution that could happen in cities. It wouldn't involve the building of code so much as the shifting of strategy to recognize game design principles for engagement. And both of those, I think, are pretty interesting. And then last, I'll just mention this engine that we've been working on, this authoring tool, Hive Mechanic. This is something that I think, like a lot of open source projects, works better if many different places are all using it and investing in it. And I think this is some of the future of digital tools for cities. They might be managed by a company that wants to sell those services, but quite often I like some of the open source models where everyone gets access to some of the tools and approaches. And I think that thinking about those investments and even consultancies that work across cities, across countries, we're going to go learn from this. We're going to go learn from Mexico City and work on the engine there a little bit, then bring them over here. So exchanges that send people across places that have been experimenting with innovations in play, I think would be particularly valuable. Mayors, often I think cities have more room to do this kind of innovation than at the nation state level. That innovating, pioneering cities can really do this kind of experimentation best.
I haven't kind of invited people to ask questions. I'm assuming that they feel free to. So if anyone wants to ask questions, if not, I keep going at it. I'm so sorry. I'm dominating all the questions, monopolizing all the questions. But maybe one last burning question I had is, what do you feel about game design being applied to culture and to even cultural scripts, the redesign of cultural scripts or even family rituals? For example, I was quite struck by such a simple example of the birthday ritual, which is, the birthday person has a cake in front and candles, and then you blow the candle. You're not supposed to say what you wish for, and everyone claps and you eat cake. And so the tweak to that simple ritual was, instead of you making that wish, everyone who's around the table would make a wish for you. And so that simple tweak of the ritual changed the entire experience, because now you're getting to hear what your friends and family is wishing for you. And it's more participatory, and it gives you kind of new information about what your family is thinking of you, how they think of you, how they perceive you, and what they wish for you. And it was quite astounding because of such a simple tweak. And so then I started thinking that in the arena of cultural scripts, whereby most of our behavior are unquestioned, that maybe some simple redesign or even introducing more sophisticated game design could be kind of interesting to consider. What do you think?
I think that's an excellent instinct that particularly aligns with games. It's not secondary. It's not just a possible, but actually I think it's a primary reorientation away from more transmission models for our social services and our information. We want people to know this about health. We want them to change their behavior in this way. And we're going to push this idea out to them. To set that aside and instead to recognize that even things like news behavior is often ritualistic. And certainly how we connect with neighbors, how we connect with government often follows ritual for some of the most interesting pieces, separate from the kind of efficiency of tools. I need to report something. So we already have good solutions on the tool side. We're already doing plenty. The value of game design is, I think, especially on the ritual side. So I'm really glad you mentioned that because I think that practicing that pivot, especially for people that have been working for a while in social service delivery and are so used to kind of a transmission, we're going to push this service or we're going to push pull, it's just straight out there. The creating of ritual spaces is often something that is essential to games. I think that this is the magic circle is something that in game studies has been talked about for a long time, where there's a deliberate artificialness around play that I think it's provocative. And it's interesting, and sports have this. You think about wrestling. You can't just go up to somebody and grab them and throw them to the ground. That would get you thrown in jail, right? But in wrestling, you're allowed to try and knock someone over. In fact, that's the only way to win, is to try and knock somebody over. So you have a different relationship with a stranger than you would ever get to have in a kind of public space otherwise. And I think that where game design can help create exceptional spaces, try something in just this space. And we're gonna change one of the rules. We're gonna change the candle blowing out, and we're gonna shift the ritual in this way. I think is super powerful. Of course, it can be, for those that are very traditional, it can be scary to change those things at all. Because once you start messing with ritual, geez, are we forgetting our values? I think above all, it takes confidence. It takes confidence that we know we're not going to forget our values. We're not going to throw our values out the window. We're going to keep our values, and having everyone give us a wish is not abandoning our values at all. In fact, it could be a way of getting in touch with them in a different way, or encouraging people to be more reflective by doing both. Sometimes we blow the candle out, sometimes we let everyone else blow the candle out. So I think that if I was to bring it back to a theme, it's this multiplicity of uses of play, that we need this richness. Rich communities have multiple ways to play, ways for young people to play, ways for adults to play. And it's a core tool in how we should be doing engagement. And I think especially as we start bringing in digital media, we're going to have these opportunities open to a lot of our social services. And I think that if we're brave enough to say we can bring our values into the kind of ritual spaces of game design, there are really, it's a huge realm of open possibilities that we're just starting to explore and are certainly going to be getting in more as a society.
Yeah. Maybe just one last question, because we are actually designing a program that seems like a game, and maybe you could advise us on what principles to think through. So the program is actually called Choose Your Own Adventure. So the typical social service agency is given a grant and they become the be-all and end-all service provider for a kind of captive client group. So what we decided to do was to create choice and autonomy for the clients. So we would stitch together a menu of services from different providers, and then they'd be given a personal budget, an expenditure budget to use. So then the data will be interesting. So if you're given a choice to use which services, would you use the counseling or the more expensive psychologist from private sector? So even that would be interesting. And then the other part of it is that we would pay the client for success. That is, if you hit this milestone, if you secure a job interview, or you stay in your job for 6 months, then you get a kind of a conditional cash transfer. So I suppose we went at this without any deep appreciation of game design. You have that. What would you, looking at this in its basic form, what would you say? Could we think of this in a better way?
Oh, I think that first of all, I congratulate you on being brave and just trying things, getting in there. This is very much in the spirit of game design, and I think that there's kind of two answers I might give. One is that a lot of early phase game design is about guessing at what works, but then really iterating. And so the design process, it's one mistake that newcomers sometimes make to game design is they spend a lot of time planning and making the thing, and then they launch it and they don't do any iteration after it. Whereas I think that great game design happens by rapidly prototyping some piece of it. I encourage paper prototyping. If you're going to get to other models, try it just by role playing. What if we showed people this? What if they got this card and it's actually going to be on a screen eventually, but let's just pretend it was this 3x5 card. I sometimes call this theatrical prototyping also, where you're almost asking people to be actors in the game. And then the key is a kind of debrief. What did you love? What was really exciting about that experience? What was really different? And picking a thing or two that you really want to make the experience awesome at, and letting some of the other ones go, because I think that games that try to do everything at the same time just turn back into the real world, and they're no longer playful. They're instead just another way to do the same system. Well, we could have multiple people choosing social services. We could have these feedback loops as part of a good just service delivery. That's great. Maybe it's just just turn it into a set of services. But I think if you're really saying, well, how is this different? How do some of the game principles really get some interesting traction? That kind of early listening and play testing, the art of play testing, I think is something that can help you refine. And I think that's maybe my primary advice when I hear this. But then if I was to think of a secondary approach, I think that the idea that you might pull different experts on game design as kind of outside consultants, and we do this as academics, right? We have grants reviewed by experts, but our game designs are often things that we build and just have evaluated. Right? So rather than just have the evaluators come in to measure impact, what if we also have other designers come in to give provocations on process? And I think that's a technique that can be a good investment of funds to have people give feedback on design process and design meaning as separate from impact evaluation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Benjamin. Did you have any parting thoughts or words for the audience here?
Well, I really appreciate the dialogue and the conversation across locations and time zones. It's been really fun talking with you, and I'm really just impressed with the conversations you're all bringing together in this series. The people's questions that have come in have also been really provocative. I think I've had some new things that I'm thinking about, so I'd love to continue the conversation. For those that are in Washington, D.C., stop by American University's Game Center. We'd love to show you some of our spaces and what we're doing there for game design, and definitely keep me appraised of what projects you all are doing. It's been fun starting this conversation.
I'm sure we will. Thank you so much, Benjamin, and have a good day, the rest of you. See you at the next one.